Thanks so much for coming to this BAR's digital event on volcanic romanticism. My name is David Higgins. I'm Professor of Environmental Humanities at the University of Leeds. I've been a long-standing member of BAR's. I was on the committee many years ago. And though occasionally my research in recent years has sort of moved away from romanticism, I always end up back there. So it's really nice to do this event, and I'm really looking forward to it. We've got 4 really exciting papers today. We're going to just take them in alphabetical order. We'll go through the papers as is traditional, and then we should have plenty of time for questions and discussions at the end. So our first paper is by Dilara Kalkan of Ataturk University. Dilara is an MA student in English language and literature. Her thesis examines how the works of second-generation English romantics, Byron, Percy Shelley, Mary Shelley, and Keats, resonate in contemporary novels, exploring the reinterpretation of romantic ideals, motifs, and literary archetypes in 21st century fiction. And the title of her paper today is From Diodati to the End of the World, The Volcanic Origins of the Last Man.
Thank you, David. I'm sharing my screen. So hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be part of this discussion on volcanic romanticism. My paper focuses on Mary Shelley's The Last Man and the ways the volcanic and apocalyptic atmosphere of 1816 shape her vision of the future. So Mary Shelley's The Last Man, published in 1826, was written after some of the hardest years of her life. Having already created one of the first science fiction stories with Frankenstein, she now turned to something new, one of the earliest apocalyptic and pandemic novels. The story feels deeply personal. After losing her husband, Percy Shelley, and then later her friend Lord Byron, and watching her close group of friends fall apart, Mary was left feeling like the only one still alive. That sense of grief and isolation shaped the novel's world, its tone, and its characters. To understand where this atmosphere began, we can look back to the summer of 1816, the famous gathering at Lake Geneva. This meeting of writers, remembered for the ghost story challenge that inspired Frankenstein, was also remarkable for its strange weather. It was the year without a summer, caused by the eruption of the Mount Tambora in Indonesia, which filled the skies with volcanic ash and turned the season dark and cold. Stuck indoors at Villa Diodati, surrounded by storms, thunder, and flashes of lightning, the group spent their time reading, writing, and discussing ideas. In her journals, Mary described the misty lake, the pines lit by lightning, and the heavy rain that never seemed to stop. The scenes of power and darkness stayed with her for years. The wild, sublime weather of Lake Geneva didn't just help create Frankenstein. It also planted the first seeds of The Last Man. The sense of isolation, the violent storms, and the beauty mixed with fear later grew into the novel's apocalyptic vision. What began as a summer of strange weather became 10 years later a world where the storms never ended. The Last Man takes place in 2073, beginning with the fall of the British monarchy and the rise of a republic. The narrator, Lionel Verney, often read as Mrs. Mary Shelley's own voice, meets Adrian, Earl of Windsor, a visionary idealist inspired by Percy Shelley. Another central figure is Lord Raymond, a proud, passionate Byronic hero based on Lord Byron. Lionel's sister Perdita, a reflection of Clairmont, marries Raymond, while Adrian's hopeless love for the Greek woman Evadne, linked to Teresa Guiccioli, adds further tension. Lionel himself falls in love with Adrian's sister, Idris, forming a close but fragile circle bound by love and ambition. While they find brief peace together at Windsor, a war between the Turks and Greeks rages in the background. Raymond becomes the protector of England, but his pride and affair with Evadne led him to the doomed campaign in Constantinople, a city already emptied by plague. Defying warnings, he marches on and meets his death. As the plague spreads, Lionel witnesses the slow destruction of everyone he loves. Idris, their children, and finally Adrian and his niece Clara, who perished in a shipwreck mirroring Percy Shelley's real death. In the end, Lionel wanders through silent cities and the last surviving human, haunted by memory and loss. At the beginning of the story, the natural world is full of vitality and beauty. The gardens and landscape reflect harmony and elegance, echoing the optimism and emotional richness of the characters' lives. Life appears as a continuous chain of actions and thoughts, each linked to the next, full of meaning and joy. Alongside the natural beauty, the intellectual life at Villa Diodati is mirrored in the novel through characters' interactions. Their discussions of politics, philosophy, and life itself echo the collaborative, creative energy Mary Shelley experienced at the Lake Geneva. This passage emphasizes the harmony between companionship and reflection. Just as at Lake Geneva, the characters inhabit both a physical and intellectual space where ideas flow freely and human relationships provide stability and joy. Quote, Adrian, Idris, and Lionel were established in Windsor Castle. Lord Raymond and Perdita inhabited a house which the former had built on the borders of the great park. When any separation took place between us, it generally so happened that Idris and Perdita would ramble away together, and we remained to discuss the affairs of nations and the philosophy of life. After a series of dramatic events, the peaceful group begins to experience tension, fear, and foreshadowing of disaster. The first signs of apocalyptic transformation occurred during the war between the Greek and Turkish armies. Lord Raymond, aware of his forcing fate, enters Istanbul with acceptance of death. The atmosphere shifts violently, the sky seems to fracture, darkness spreads, and sparks and flames fly through the air. His death is followed by Perdita's tragic suicide, marking a complete transformation of the once serene world. Quote, but at that moment, a crash was heard, thunder like it reverberated through the sky, while the air was darkened. A moment more and the old walls again met my sight, while over them hovered the murky cloud, fragments of buildings wheeled above, half seen in smoke, while flames burst out beneath, and continued explosions filled the air with terrific thunders. Later, they witnessed a series of extraordinary and terrifying events. People report a black sun and endless night, creating a sense that the end of the world has arrived. Similar phenomena are reported in Persia, China, and Greece as well. The dark and ominous atmosphere mirrors the stormy, unpredictable weather at Lake Geneva. Quote, a strange story was brought to us from the East, to which little credit would have been given had not the fact been arrested by a multitude of witnesses in various parts of the world. On the 21st of June, it was said that, an hour before noon, a black sun arose, an orb, the size of that luminary, but dark, defined, whose beams were shadows, ascended from the west. In about an hour it had reached the meridian, and eclipsed the bright parent of today. Night fell upon every country, night, sudden, rayless, entire. Lionel has lost his wife and children, leaving only with Adrian and Clara. They journey to Switzerland to escape the plague, retracing landscape Mary Shelley herself visited. These passages recreate Alpine scenery, connecting memory, loss, and the sublime. Tragedy culminates as Adrian and Clara die in a shipwreck. Lionel, now completely alone, embodies the novel's title and the ultimate isolation of humanity. Like Mary Shelley, Lionel records his experiences in a journal, preserving memory and giving structure to grief. Writing becomes a way to honor the death and the process of magnitude of loss. Through journaling, Lionel bridges the gap between the past and the present, between personal experience and literary creation. The act of recording becomes a means of surviving emotional devastation and maintaining a connection to what is lost. I want to finish my paper with this quote from The Last Man. Quote, life, it began thus, is not the thing romance writers describe it, going through the measures of a dance and after various evolutions, arriving at a conclusion when the dancers may sit down and repose. While there is life, there is action and change. We go on, each thought linked to the one which was its parent, each act to a previous act, no joy or sorrow of dice barren of progency, which forever generated, and generation waves the chain that make our life. Even amid volcanic gloom, storms and the shadows of mortality, life continues. An endless chain of thought, grief, and imagination. The Last Man transforms the volcanic darkness of 1816 into a metaphor for survival, for continuing to write, even when the world itself seemed to end. That concludes my presentation. Thank you all for listening.
Thanks very much for that, Laura. Really enjoyed it. Thank you. Our next speaker is Katrina Leontu, a researcher in environmental humanities whose work bridges romantic literature, climate studies, and critical posthumanism. Her PhD at the University of Leeds explores eco-apocalyptic narratives in 18th century poetry and contemporary climate discourse through interdisciplinary, empirical, and arts-based methodologies. Over to you, Katrina.
Great, thank you, David. So I'll try to upload my presentation so that I can start. Think you can all see it now? So the title of my paper today is Before Tambora, Cooper, the Lucky Haze and the Emergence of Volcanic Romanticism. So I'm not going to focus on the summer of 1816, the summer without, but instead I'm going to go back in time and focus on the Lucky Haze. And this is part of my, my PhD. So the first part of the presentation will focus on Cooper and his response to the volcanic effects of the lucky fissures in Iceland. And then in the second part, I'm going to talk about how I used parts of the task, Cooper's long poem, in an empirical context. So like more to come. So let me move. Okay, so this is a roadmap of the presentation. In case it takes long, David, please feel free to interrupt me. So I'll try to keep it short. So first, I'll start with the context, which is the lucky eruptions from 1783.
Just to say, no rush, Katrina. I think we're pretty good for time.
Okay. Okay. So first, I'll provide the context for the 1783-84 lucky eruptions and their cultural impact. And then I'll focus on Cooper's The Task and examine it through the tropes of apocalypse, revelation, and the crazy earth. Then I'll move into volcanic romanticism and ecological anxiety, and I will try to talk about how ecological anxiety registers in the task. And after that, I'll move into the methodological intervention that I made for my own PhD research, using the task, as I said, as a tool for ecological reflection. And then at the end, I will briefly talk about the implications of using poetry in a different context and outside the field of literature studies. So, okay, so let's start with the lucky fissures. So just give me a moment, please. So as I said, while Tambora and the year without a summer of 1816 are often seen as the defining moments when volcanism entered the romantic imagination, the earlier eruptions of the lucky fissures in 1783 and 1884 had already inaugurated the poetics of planetary catastrophe. William Cooper's The Task, written in the haze-filled aftermath of Lucky, registers atmospheric disorder and weather anomalies through biblical eschatology and apocalyptic tropes. So I will explore how Cooper's presentation of meteorological and moral upheaval transforms this environmental disturbance into revelation, fusing theological theodicy with early forms of empirical observation. So, by situating Cooper alongside later figures such as Byron and Mary Shelley, I trace a romantic arc of volcanic imaginaries, which start from divine punishment and move to moral anxiety and secular apocalypse, and also speculative futurity. I also want to suggest that this historical arc also prefigures the imaginative and methodological challenges of the present. So, in my own approach, I revisit the task not only as an early example of romantic environmental writing, but also as a tool of contemporary reflection, which we can use in order to try to make sense of our current ecological crisis. Okay. So, a bit of history now. The lucky fissure eruptions began on the 8th of June in 1783 and continued for almost 8 months. So this is the valley in Iceland where the fissures are located, and this is obviously what it looks like today. So the effects of these fissures exploding were extraordinary. A haze, often described as dry fog, covered much of the northern hemisphere. And across Europe, observers reported blood red sunsets, drought, violent thunderstorms, and crop failures. And without a clear understanding of atmospheric circulation or volcanic aerosols, the cause of the phenomenon was unknown. So the event produced a crisis of interpretation. Natural philosophers sought material explanations, while many members of the clergy read the haze as a sign of divine wrath, and they saw it as the end of the days. Okay, so it is against this background that William Cooper began writing the task. So the poem's combination of this domestic tranquility and cosmic anxiety mirrors the contradiction of this moment. As the world that they inhabited, it was both familiar and suddenly completely unstable and dynamic beyond their understanding. So let's move on to the next slide. So this is William Cooper, and now I'm going to talk about the task and its critical content. So the task was published in 1785. And at first, it appears that it to belong to the Georgic tradition. It's a long meditative poem of pastoral scenes and moral reflection. Yet beneath its calm surface runs an undercurrent of unease. So, for example, in Book 2, The Timepiece, Cooper writes, "Fires from beneath and meteors from above, portentous, unexampled, and unexplained, have kindled beacons in the skies, and the old and crazy earth has had her shaking fits." These lines, I contend, constitute one of the earliest poetic responses to what we might now describe as a global environmental event. Cooper's Crazy Earth encapsulates the late 18th century growing awareness of the Earth as a body of its own, with a history independent from the human presence. The language of divine portents coexists with empirical observation, and the poem registers natural disaster as both a theological revelation, but also at the same time as a natural phenomenon. And this doubleness is crucial. Cooper, being a fervent evangelical, his work often reflects his belief in divine providence, and is matched with his own spiritual angst about human sin and salvation. But there's also a descriptive precision in how he presents the weather anomalies of 1783, the fires from beneath, the beacons in the sky. All of these gesture towards an early understanding of the geological vitality of the planet. Cooper's keen reading of the newspapers and travel narratives of his time contributed to his awareness of those cultural affairs, current affairs, and the developments in the domain of natural philosophy. So he displays an awareness of what was happening. At the same time, though, there's an oscillation between his own evangelical beliefs about salvation and a theological understanding of the universe. So the task often offers a very complex and often contradictory response to nature, time, and geophysical instability. And for me, Cooper's poem occupies a liminal space between religious explanation and emergent scientific discourse. As I said, on the one hand, it invokes familiar forms of biblical narratives or biblical beliefs and theodicy, but at the same time, it also incorporates empirical observations and reflects a growing awareness of all of the natural systems of the time. And to quote Tobias Manley, the task is marked by the uncertainties and anxieties of a modern climate. And here we can see an excerpt of the task. So the task, even though mirrors a cultural shift from providential stability towards a more environmental contingency. So the critical, I'll take a break. How am I doing for time?
You're on. You've been speaking for about 9 minutes, Katerina.
Okay, so still have 5 to 6 minutes. All
Yeah.
right. Okay, so I'll skip the other things I wanted to say. So I'll just now present. So this is how I examined and how I viewed the task in my own approach. So I'm seeing this as a poem that stands with, both legs, one leg in the Holocene and the other leg in the Anthropocene. So it presently integrates current anxieties which we're also faced with today, about the vitality and the dynamism of the planet, and tries to make sense of that change. So now I'm going to move into how I use the task in an empirical context in order to see how contemporary audiences respond to it, and trace these continuities and discontinuities between romantic ideas and discourses of change with contemporary climate discourse. And you can see here this excerpt from book 2, The Timepiece. I've highlighted in bold what I consider to be the most seminal part of this excerpt. So, as you can see here, Cooper talks about a world that seems to toll the death bell of its own disease. It preaches the general doom. The weather phenomena cause him to think that everything is portentous, unexampled, and unexplained. And F is seen as crazy. Right. So I've used these in creative interviews, and I'm going to show it to you exactly. So this is the methodological intervention. So using the timepiece, part of the timepiece, I invited climate scientists and creative practitioners to have an interview, an open-ended creative interview. I used 2 excerpts from book 2 and book 6, but now I'm only focusing on book 2. And the purpose of that was to probe them, to think about crisis, temporality, and agency via 19th century text. So in thinking about apocalypse, I like to go back to Bruno Latour and see what he says about the apocalypse as a provocation. And this is how I approach it. So Latour says that to become sensitive, that is, to feel our responsibility and thus to turn back on our own action, we have to position ourselves through a set of totally artificial steps, as though we were at the end of time, and thus give Paul's warning its meaning. Those who mourn should live as if they did not. Those who are happy as if they were not. Those who buy something as if they were not theirs to keep. Those who use the things of the world as if not engrossed in them. For this world, in its present form, is passing away. So this is the provocation for me that's in the back of my mind. Obviously, I'm not using this in the interviews. I'm only using the poem. And based on this approach, I'm approaching reading as a method. And I developed this 3-stage reading process, which involves the following steps: anagnosis, diagnosis, and prognosis. So anagnosis is the first encounter with the poem, where I invite the participants to have a first reading of the poem, the part of the poem I use, and to see how they feel about it, what sort of affective connections they can have to it, the sort of images that I instantly emerge in their minds, and to feel the rhythm of the poem. So that's the first encounter. But then the next level is the diagnostic level. So here, through the interview, I invite the participants to critically reflect on what is revealed in the poem about the present. So in a way, it's like an apocalyptic encounter with the text, because I sort of expect the participants to, to start digging in order to make a revelation. And then the last stage is the prognostic stage, where participants are asked to speculate and think about the future, if restoration is possible, and how like human and non-human relations, how they figure in the future. So these 3 stages are followed in these interviews. Obviously, not always in that order. So we go back and forth because it's quite experimental, and to the poem, and they respond to it. On this method and what it means for volcanic romanticism. So the project bridges literary studies and environmental social sciences, and I use poetry as a method to do that. And it demonstrates how poetic language can connect our own experiences, emotional responses, and our thoughts on ethical modes of knowing and how we respond to the planet. Importantly, it reactivates Cooper's apocalyptic and restorative poetics, and it places it within a contemporary climate discourse. So in that sense, it sees the current ecological crisis in its historical context, but also from a cultural studies perspective. It kind of reveals those continuities in the way we talk about change, especially in view of the Enlightenment and Enlightenment epistemology. It also shows that romantic imagination can be a living tool for navigating uncertainty and planetary care. Of course, tool might not be the best term to use because it might displace literature to the eyes of some. Okay, and I'm concluding. Okay, and finally, yes, it highlights, this research highlights how romantic tensions figure between fear and hope, science and faith, and data and emotion. Okay, so this is my bibliography. Thank you, and sorry for taking a bit longer.
Not at all, Katrina. That was really, really interesting. Thanks so much. So our next speaker is Chloe Melvin, who is a recent MA by Research graduate from the University of Birmingham. Her research has investigated the works of Percy Shelley and Mary Shelley with a focus on biographical and historical analysis, examining love, poetic artistry, politics, and poetic legacy. She is pursuing a career in education before applying for a PhD. Over to you, Chloe.
Lovely, thank you, David. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint now. Okay, hopefully you can all see that okay. So my paper today is called The Veil of Life and Death, the Volcanic Sublimity, sorry, of Shelley's Mountains.
I don't think we can see that PowerPoint at the moment, so you might want to try that share.
Oh, sorry, I'll give it another go. There we go.
Yeah, that's great. That's good.
Fabulous. Thank you, David. So yeah, my paper today is on the Veil of Life and Death, the volcanic sublimity of Shelley's Mountains. Today, I'm primarily focusing on Shelley's poem Mont Blanc, which I think is an amazing poem. It's got some great lyric texture to it. And I think it gives us a good basis to talk about the impact of Mount Tambora on the Diodati Circle and on Shelley's own poetic artistry. As David said in his bio of me, I'm really interested in historical and biographical analyses of the Romantics in particular. And just to examine some of Shelley's childhood biography before we start, G.M. Matthews says that we learn in his early teens, his imagination was always roving upon something romantic and extraordinary, such as spirits, fairies, fighting, volcanoes, etc. And according to Hogg, Shelley was also passionately fond of fireworks, to which volcanic displays were naturally often compared. And as psychologists would doubtless interpret both interests in sexual terms. So I think what we can gather from Shelley's childhood is he has a very strong curiosity for the dangerous and wild elements of the natural world. And this is something that he was experimenting with in his childhood education. So to move on to Mount Tambora, since 1755, a series of disasters had profoundly disrupted the complacency of 18th century belief. Mount Tambora's eruption in 1815 was disruptive for the whole of Europe. It disturbed travel and changed the plans of Europe's travellers by changing the anticipated summery climate into that of an ash cloud. There we go. So to keep it brief, I'm going to examine three elements of the sort of themes that we find in Mont Blanc, namely power, the power of the mountain and its surrounding environments, the religious imagery that is used when describing Mont Blanc, and also the mountain as a sort of educational force, which is a very Shelleyan motif, using nature to sort of inspire poetic creativity and also moral values for people. First of all, I've got a quote from Richard Holmes's great biography of Shelley, The Pursuit. His overall impression of Mont Blanc was one of overwhelming power. It frightened and fascinated him. He was filled with awe and the sense of his own limited human intelligence brought face to face with enormous natural energies. I think what is interesting about Mont Blanc is it really examines the tensions between the great scale of mountains and the sort of insignificance and unknowing of human beings. Okay. So first of all, the power elements of the poem. I'm just going to read a brief extract. Mont Blanc yet gleams on high, the power is there. The still and solemn power of many sights and many sounds, and much of life and death. In the calm darkness of the moonless nights, in the lone glare of the day, the snow descends. Upon that mountain, none beholds him there. I think what's interesting about Shelley's representation of Mont Blanc is that the mountain has no need for humanity. The mountain is characterized by personified adjectives such as still, solemn, lone, and calm. The mountain is portrayed as something which is still, eternal, and all-powerful, and which has very little regard for the human interference that is often gathered by its visitors. I think what is interesting about Mont Blanc is Shelley very much characterizes it as being within the everlasting universe of things. And this is characterized by its great heights and great depths. He describes it as piercing into the sky, and also it has great roots into the ground. So it is an everlasting presence of the environment, and it is something which cannot be ignored. How hideously its shapes are heaped around, rude, bare, and high, ghastly and scarred and riven, is this scene where the old earthquake demon taught her young ruin. Were these her toys, or did a sea of fire envelop once this silent snow? None can reply, all seems eternal now. I think in this passage we're really getting into the sublime nature of Mont Blanc, that it is at once a really beautiful and magnificent example of the natural world, but also it is impressive and towering over the local landscape. And it is also a site where earthquakes really disturb the natural world and really present a dangerous element into human life. And I think this is the interesting contrast between the mountain as a beautiful site and the mountain as a sort of dangerous and wild sort of threat to human life. And this is also typified by Shelley's experience here. Richard Holmes says the experience which Shelley underwent at Chamonix was something close to a religious experience. And I think seeing the mountain in its full glory really typifies that for Shelley, as a notable atheist, that nature really is a godly substitute in Shelley's life. Some of the quotes I've included here include, far, far above, piercing the infinite sky, Mont Blanc appears, still snowy and serene. Its subject mountains are unearthly forms, blue as the overhanging heaven, the secret strength which governs thought, and to the infinite dome of heaven is a law, inhabits thee. I think what's interesting about these sections is the snowy sort of covering of Mont Blanc appears to be angelic in its nature. It is still and serene, as if it were an angel in heaven. But actually we know that the mountain is cold and dangerous, and it is somewhere between gothic and ghastly and beautiful and heavenly. Furthermore, I think the mountain as an educational force is a really interesting topic. I'll read this passage here. The wilderness has a mysterious tongue which teaches awful doubt, or faith so mild, so solemn, so serene, that man may be but for such a faith, with nature reconciled. Thou hast a voice, great mountain, to repeal large codes of fraud and woe, not understood by all, but which the wise and great and good interpret, or make felt, or deeply feel. Even these primeval mountains teach the averting mind. I think something which occurs in a lot of Shelley's lyric poetry is looking at nature as a source of inspiration and as a source of education. So for example, in the Skylark, and Kate might be coming on to the cloud. Some more examples include Ode to the West Wind. Shelley uses the natural world as a sort of springboard from which we can learn. The sort of learning that occurs from the mountain, which is mysterious and which makes us interpret and feel and deeply feel at that, is a sort of emotional learning. It's an emotional education which which cannot compare to the logic of formal education, which was so prevalent in the Romantic era. I think it typifies a more deep thinking, which is a natural consequence of the work of Coleridge and Wordsworth and their sort of theories about really listening to nature and thinking and learning and observing, rather than being arrogant and selfishly using the environment for one's own gains. Coming to my final thoughts, Shelley does not present any really satisfying conclusions regarding Mont Blanc, the natural world and man's place within it, the coexistence of several uncomfortable truths regarding the natural world, including its power, quasi-religious status in the minds of society, and the place of nature as an educational force does not give us any instruction, nor should we expect it to. And I think this typifies some of the elements of hubris that I've been talking about. The natural world is not here for us to demand explanations about our lives or what we should do with it or how we should treat it. The natural world is something beautiful and terrifying and imposing, which exists for its own purpose. And it is our job to understand and interact with it and to be guided by it, as Shelley instructs us to. We're left as readers with the uncomfortable feeling of the sublime, just as Shelley was when he first saw Mont Blanc. We feel that the natural world is something beautiful and remarkable, but which has a dangerous undercurrent with the capacity to change the environment and endanger human lives at any point. While we can learn to coexist with the natural world in harmony, Shelley's repeated reference to the earthquake demon highlights that the natural world remains a powerful force to be feared and revered. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. I'm going to hand back to David now.
Thanks so much, Chloe. I really enjoyed that. So our final speaker is Kate Nankervis, a third-year PhD researcher at the University of York. Her research focuses on clouds and Romantic period poetry and landscape painting as a way into identifying the period's new mode of ecological consciousness. Her work is supported by the AHRC through the White Rose College of Arts and Humanities. Over to you, Kate.
Thank you, David, and thank you everyone so far for your wonderful papers. Hopefully the tech continues to work. Here we go. Okay. On the 22nd of December, 1784, an essay by Benjamin Franklin was presented to the Manchester Literary and Philosophical Society. The essay, entitled Meteorological Imaginations and Conjectures, speculates on the connection between the lake eruption in Iceland, 1783, and the severe winter that took hold soon after across Europe and much of the Northern Hemisphere. Franklin was not the first to link volcanic eruptions with dramatic climate changes, but he played an important part in popularizing the idea. His description of a, quote, permanent dry cloud that blocked the sun with a universal fog clarifies this weather event of 1783 as a global phenomenon, and so implies a conception of climate that is internationally connected. Franklin's essay was part of the growing understanding of climate as a dynamic global system, which with the emergence of meteorological science was increasingly connected to culture. For example, the cloud naming system invented by meteorologist Luke Howard caught the attention of several key Romantic figures, most famously the German polymath Goethe and British painter John Constable. My research focuses, as David introduced me, on how clouds in Romantic period poetry and painting provided a useful medium for artists to explore the reconception of environment as dynamically evolving and to include climate as a world-making agent. This evening, I'm going to be examining the skies of Percy Shelley's poetry in an attempt to trace the shift towards a more globalised understanding of climate, as well as its impacts on subjectivity. In keeping with the panel's theme, I'll be focusing on poems written after the 1815 Mount Tambora eruption. The impact of this event on the period's literature has been addressed by scholars such as our chair, David Higgins, who has shown how the sublime changeability of the weather of 1816 influenced the creativity of Percy Shelley and his coterie. As I'm going to be exploring, Shelley's conception of climate as a global and world-making agent becomes more unsettled after 1816. The climate-engineered utopia of Queen Mab is reimagined later in Prometheus Unbound, but I find that the persistence of clouds in the poem evokes a solastalgic yearning for the local, which ultimately disturbs the global impulse that is evident in the early decades of the 19th century. So since my focus is largely on the affective experience of climate and climatological disruption, I'm prefacing the paper with the definition of this neologism solastalgia. The term was coined by environmental philosopher Glenn Albrecht in 2005. It denotes a type of eco-anxiety used to describe environmentally induced distress resulting from an experience of the transformation of one's home or a loved place. Unlike nostalgia, this is a kind of distress that occurs when environmental change impacts the sufferer while they are still directly connected to their environment. In simple terms, it is a homesickness that you have while you're still at home. Commonly referred to as the year without a summer, 1816, as we've heard from previous papers, was a period of social and climatic upheaval as people all over Britain, Europe, and North America struggled in the face of severe weather conditions. It was also the year that the Shelleys left England for Europe, a trip that included a stay in Geneva and a renowned stormy night that would result in some of the most famous literary works in British literature. During this trip, Mary and Percy kept a shared journal, which was published in 1817 as a history of a 6 weeks tour. This document, along with copious extant letters, provides excellent accounts of the tumultuous weather that affected Europe immediately after the Tambora eruption. The journal records that despite having departed London on a hotter day that has been known in this climate for many years, the start of their now famous stay in Geneva was marked by an unusually late spring and excessive cold. Throughout their travels, the Shelleys compare the English climate to that of different European countries, generally complaining about the cold gloom of the former. For example, in a letter of 1822, Mary characterises England as a persistently overcast island, describing it as a cloud-environed isle that contrasts with the bright sky of dear Italy. And at the start of their 1816 journey, Mary relates their departure as a kind of climatological liberation. Many of the accounts of a particular landscape or weather phenomenon are viewed in terms of how they measure up to their homeland, such as their account of a journey through Holland's countryside, in which they compared the delicious verdure of the fields with the rich and green grass of England. The convening of European and English climates in this way is similarly evoked in Shelley's post-1816 poems. These meteorological imaginations imply the apprehension of a global climate system. Moreover, the climate comparisons point to a complexity that exists in the poet's relationship with his home nation. The clouds, gloom and rain of England evidently deepened the resentment and alienation that Shelley felt towards his home country. And in 1818, following the suicide of Percy's first wife Harriet Westbrook and losing custody of his children, the Shelleys moved to Italy, effectively exiling themselves from England. The significance of this relocation is notably defined in terms of the climatological differences, which Shelley describes in a letter to Thomas Love Peacock on the 6th of April, 1818. No sooner had we arrived at Italy than the loveliness of the earth and the serenity of the sky made the greatest difference in my sensations. I depend on these things for life, for in the smoke of cities and the tumult of humankind and the chilling fogs and rain of our own country, I can hardly be said to live. The serenity and cloudless nature of the Italian sky is repeatedly contrasted against the cloudiness of England in Shelley's later works. Consulting a lexical concordance of Shelley's poetry, I found that azure occurs 70 times, while Wordsworth, who spent most of his life amidst the clouds of the Lake District, uses it only on 24 occasions. There is also a definite increase in Shelley's use of the word in the poems composed after his move to Italy. An excellent example of the poet's projection of a good versus bad climate is found in Lines Written Among the Euganean Hills, October 1818. Ostensibly, as the title declares, this is a poem set in and inspired by the Italian landscape. Indeed, Venice is depicted as a sun-girt city where the rising sun in sapphire-tinted skies transforms column, tower, and dome and spire into obelisks of fire. By contrast, the clouds are devices that obstruct vision and freedom. Quote, clouds withstain truth's rising day by her sun consumed away, and so prevent new nations from springing forth with more kindly blossoming. Towards the close, the poet imagines an idealized place characterized by its balmy, unpolluted climate. He writes, Soft sunshine and the sound of old forests echoing round, we may live so happy there that the spirits of the air envying us may even entice to our healing paradise the polluting multitude, but their rage would be subdued by the clime divine and calm. Shelley's assertion of this sunny present of self-exile in Italy, however, does not deny the present in England. Rather, I find a haunting azure of the skies by the atmospheres of the poet's homeland. As I've mentioned, the title tells us that the poem is set in the Italian countryside. However, the land evoked in the opening lines is reminiscent of England's green and pleasant land, or rather a green and cloudy land, as shown in these lines on the screen now. About 30 lines later, the speaker finds himself on that beach of a northern sea which tempests shake eternally. Not only is this unsettlingly foreshadowing of the poet's untimely death, but it also unsettles the certainty of the poem's geography. Finally, towards the poem's end, Shelley describes the atmospheric effects of the lowering sunlight on a misty autumn afternoon. The imagery in these lines is very similar to the description of a moment in a letter from June 1816, in which Shelley talks nostalgically about the autumnal skies of England. On watching the sun set behind dark, frowning Jura, he writes that the valleys are then tinged by that glowing rose-like hue which is observed in England to attend on the clouds of an autumnal sky when the daylight is almost gone. So now to move on to Prometheus Unbound. From late 1818 to late 1819, Shelley worked on this lyrical drama. In this text, the narrative works towards a dream of a climate-engineered utopia, which is characterized by the dichotomy of a cold and clouded environment versus a warm and cloudless one, which also serves as a metaphor for tyranny versus liberation. However, eliminating the changeable agency and variety of a global interconnected climate means eliminating the variety of human subjective experience in relation to that dynamic environment. This is the paradox that Shelley implicitly explores in Prometheus Unbound. Despite the steady movement towards a world serene and bright, a certain cloudiness persists. Just as the self-exiled poet's memories of growing up in cloudy England would always inform his blue sky present in Italy. The drama begins with the Titan Prometheus nailed to the black, wintry, dead, unmeasured mountain, who is then perpetually tortured by the icy, inorganic environment. In these lines, suffering is inflicted by the tyrant Jupiter, who is characterized as a destructive force akin to the natural catastrophes of earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and hurricanes. He is described as bringing a solid cloud to rain hot thunderstones and travels in a chariot of sulphurous cloud, which further links the moral and environmental pollution of humanity to tyranny. As the chorus of aerial spirits declare at the opening of the drama, the atmosphere of human thought is dim and dank and grey like a storm-extinguished day, but they hope that one day it will be bright like, quote, cloudless skies and windless streams, silent, liquid and serene. Eric Goodall observes that the shifting atmospherics in this poem provide consistent metaphor for progressive social reform, as the action moves through a range of climates, each representing a different condition of the human spirit. Certainly, the imagery of the atmosphere is shifting. However, a closer look at this atmosphere shows Shelley's metaphor to be less consistent and cloudier than Goodall assumes. In Shelley's vision of a climate utopia, clouds are troublesome as they unsettle the clear progression towards an enlightened, climate-stable world. This tension is established by the confusing cloud imagery in the first act. The ethereal chorus of spirits that make a prophetic prediction of the fate of humanity are notably cloud-like. They are said to inhabit the world surrounding ether and gather like flocks of clouds in spring's delightful weather, thronging in the blue air. Their very, quote, cloudless and boundless characterization renders them supernatural emblems of the flowing love and liberty predicted in their prophecy. However, the mortal Prometheus is also described as being, quote, like a cloud before he was imprisoned, thus confusing the boundaries between human and supernatural, which further blurs the boundaries of human and non-human. This image of the Titan as an entrapped cloud is preserved in the spirit's prophecy as they describe how like a triumphant storm did flee, like a conqueror swift and proud, between with many a captive cloud. Here, the liberating spirit of reform is later depicted as a storm bursting its cloudy prison. Again, these are strange, unnatural images, since clouds are by nature ungraspable, permeable, and supposedly already liberated things. Although the poem follows a progression from obscure darkness to enlightenment, in which society is reformed in a bath of azure light, clouds are the vehicle that enables this progress. They possess a transformative power. In Act 2, when Asia and Panthea are sent to the cave of Demogorgon, which is shrouded beneath a wide plain of billowy mist, it is through this cloudy strife that they must travel in order to question the creation of the universe. Returning to the mountaintop, they pause within a cloud, and it's in this atmospheric medium that Asia undergoes her transformation into a pure, bright, radiating light of love. The revelatory moment, then, arises from moving through and beyond the obscuring fog, not dissimilar to Mount Snowdon passage in Wordsworth's Prelude. The established dichotomy of veiling cloud versus clarifying light is further complicated by Shelley, who also depicts clouds as a literal vehicle for change, as in the image of Jove's chariot of sulphurous cloud, which in the final act becomes the chariot of the enlightening deity, whose wheels are of solid clouds, azure and gold. Shelley's utopian climate is not as cloudless as it might first appear. Clouds play an important role in the human experience of past, present, and the future environments. And by the final act, it is the clouds that are heavy with love's sweet rain, which in this reviving and renewing element that allows the human world to be reformed. Lastly, the new freedom and peace is envisioned in the arrival of a deity whose origin is meteorological. The image presented in these lines of the divine in the form of a life-bringing storm cloud is inconsistent with the previous characterization of the tyrant Jupiter as a destructive thundercloud. This contradiction recalls the unpredictable agency of the sentient cloud subject in Shelley's poem.
I've just lost sound. Is it just me?
Oh, I don't
I
know.
think everyone lost sound for a moment there. Perhaps we
Yeah.
could start from the beginning of the slide.
Oh, I'm on my last, I've got like 3 sentences left.
Perfect.
Will I just say them? So the poem does reach its desired end, climate-engineered utopia, but the uncertainty developed by the poem's cloud imagery checks the idealism of the utopian vision. The image of a serene, azure environment presented in Prometheus Unbound snags on the persistent clouds, which serve as a reminder of the poet's homeland, the cloud-environed isle. And in the end, Shelley's vision of a globally homogenized climate-stable world might be viewed as an unconvincing denial of a yearning for the local and a feeling of home. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much, Kate, and everyone. That was a wonderful set of papers, fantastic. And all 4 of them really interesting, but also concise and not self-indulgent. So that's much appreciated. Thank you, everyone. We've got, because they've been so well organised, the speakers, we've got plenty of time for questions and discussion. I don't know, Matt and Roslyn, is there a normal protocol for this? Do you prefer questions from in the chat, or do you want people to put their hands up? What's the best way of proceeding?
Given that we have quite a few people in the room, it might be best if people raise their hands if they're comfortable unmuting their mic. But for those of you that would prefer to post into the chat, then either myself or Matt will read them out for you. And David, you have the pleasure of inviting each of the speakers once you know whose hands are raised.
Okay, shall I look for the hands and you can
Exactly.
handle the chat? Okay, that sounds good.
Perfect.
Well, there is a hand. I'm just going to find out where the hand is. I think it's Philip. Do you want to ask a question, Philip?
Yes, please. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you to all the panelists for those excellent papers. Greetings from Geneva. Unfortunately, you can't see Mont Blanc because it's night. But I have a comment/question for Chloe. You mentioned the notion of power while speaking about the poem Mont Blanc, and quoted those lines describing a sea of fire. A little later in fact, it's just the next. It's the lines immediately after that. The poem mentions a whole sort of panorama of sublime scenes: the fields, the lakes, the forests, all the living things that dwell within the daedal earth, lightning and rain, earthquake, and then again, and fiery flood and hurricane. And then a little later, power dwells apart in its tranquility, remote, serene, and inaccessible. And as you were giving your excellent paper, I was wondering about that contrast between sublime climatic meteorological spectacle, and then Mont Blanc as this seeming symbol or embodiment of something permanent, something that dwells apart, something that seems to not be affected by all of this. Although, as you mentioned, of course, there's the whole question of whether the earthquake demons were playing here and hurling rocks, and there's the whole question of the geological origins of the mountains. But I was just wondering, what is that, perhaps in your opinion, the relationship between well, let's stick to the topic of the panel, say the volcanic sublime, which implies eruptions and violence, natural spectacle, and then Mont Blanc as the embodiment of something that appears to be apart from all of that. I don't know if that makes any sense, but
definitely. Thank you for the question, Philip. It's really interesting. I think it's interesting, just looking at the poem as a whole, how much time for a poem that is called Mont Blanc Shelley devotes to the descriptions of the vale and the trees and the river and the mountains around it. And I think it is emblematic of a very symbiotic relationship that the mountain has with the vale and the trees and everything. I think it sort of evokes themes of the life cycle and how each part of nature feeds into another, and every part of nature relies on another to survive. And that makes me think about volcanic ash and how when a volcano erupts, it expels lava and magma, and then the ash goes into the ground and fertilizes the ground. So I think it's this real contrast between the threat of death, and I did some research and it was saying that about 6,000 to 8,000 people have been killed on Mont Blanc through disasters in the past. Still 100 people a year are killed on Mont Blanc as well. So it's a very dangerous climate to be in, but also, ironically, through the dangers of, like we've said, expulsions of volcanic eruptions, it does breathe new life. So it's this great contrast, and I still don't know where I stand on it, but I think that is the beauty of the sublime, this great birth and death and the ever-evolving life cycle. So yeah, thanks for a great question, Philip.
Thanks a lot. I think Aubrey Williams has got his hand up.
Yes, that's right. Thank you. So really interesting papers, all of them. I did have a question for Kate, who I definitely don't know in real life. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on solastalgia, because this was a really interesting concept I'd never heard of, and I'd like to learn more about. And I was also wondering if you'd identified an instance or instances in Shelley's life where you think he appears to experience this.
Thank you, Aubrey. Well, I love talking about solastalgia. It's one of those, there's a lot of eco-anxiety terms being thrown about, I think, nowadays, which are useful at times. Solastalgia is very interesting, I think, because the emphasis there is on the still being connected to the place that is changing or has been changed. So there's again, the kind of sense of the uncanny and the unsettling feeling of even a return home to a home that doesn't feel like home anymore, but you still live there. And I think there's kind of like it's kind of at a distance for Shelley because he leaves England, and I think in his biography anyway, it does seem like he has quite a complicated relationship with his homeland and his the people that he associates, and his home country, like on a like political and national level. He kind of like seeks liberation, and I think you spoke quite a lot, Chloe, about the mountain and the dual aspect of the mountain, and Switzerland and the landscapes there have a kind of utopian draw to the Shelley coterie, I think, which I think ultimately, in my reading of Shelley's biography and his and his poems, and specifically his cloud imagery, is the grass isn't greener on the other side, and there's like an unsettling feeling wherever he goes, and that is because of his kind of self-exiling, I suppose, which is in itself quite a complicated process, I imagine. It's like, you know, a decision he has had to reconcile with, and then the never to return home as well, so there isn't kind of any closure on a biographical level. I think, interestingly, I was just having a look at Mont Blanc, and obviously I'm always looking at the clouds. So there's a lot. He characterizes the spirits in that poem as a homeless cloud, which I think is really quite revealing in terms of your question, in this idea of being untethered and feeling homeless in a place that was idealized to the Shelley coterie, I think, and this feeling of there being a fresh start. I said in my paper that Mary characterizes their kind of departure from England as a liberation, and she talks about their stormy crossing, and then when they arrive, she describes how it's cloudless, the sunrise, and it's cloudless. So there's this very big, it's very much portrayed in kind of meteorological and climatological differences, which I think is so wrapped up in the English identity, weather as being kind of a stereotype. So solastalgia, yeah, I think it's a useful way for us to kind of access it from a contemporary perspective. It might be anachronistic, but I think it's interesting because nostalgia in the Romantics is it's so long spoken about. I thought maybe solastalgia would be an interesting kind of fresh take potentially on that aspect. I hope that answers your question.
No, thank you. That's great. It's also given me a lot of interesting food for thought. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I don't see any more hands up. How are we doing in the chat?
There's just one, and it's another question for Kate. How is subjectivity suggested in Shelley's poems that you have discussed today?
Thank you so much, Victoria. So for me, and my interpretation of subjectivity is that it's quite porous in the poems that I've looked at, but also when I've been doing other reading of Shelley's kind of letters and his own kind of biographical information. And this kind of comes into my use of the kind of new meteorological language of Luke Howard, and kind of the new meteorological science, which it often uses language like porous, elastic, very like transitional words, I suppose, and boundless words to describe different like scientific phenomena, I suppose. But I see that in Shelley's poetry, and especially in Prometheus Unbound. Obviously, there's a lot of imagery that's very elemental and kind of transformational, and this kind of movement towards a utopia, or like, you know, radiant light, and a kind of I think that there's the famous in Queen Mab as well. I kind of spoke about this, or I touched upon it in my chapter anyway. There's a really interesting footnote, which I'm sure everyone knows about, where he kind of talks about this idea of the poles being aligned on the Earth, and through that reaching this kind of climate utopia. And I think that kind of comes through in how he talks about the affective experience of kind of being in these environmental spaces. It's a reciprocal kind of subjectivity with Shelley's kind of human figures and the ecologies around him, which I think you really brought out nicely, Chloe, in your last answer in Mont Blanc. Is like an ecology there, and even when it's kind of maybe fraught or what's the word, catastrophic, there's still kind of like a fluidity and a network, a system that's there, that's kind of making sense. And that's the subjectivity that I'm arguing for, kind of a more fluid, more dynamic subjectivity in this reconceptualization of environment, where the human perhaps isn't at the center but more marginal in this kind of new age of science in the early 19th century. I hope that answers the question a bit.
I think that's really, really interesting. Thanks. Thanks for the question. And I know that Matt has suggested that we kind of take it more widely in the chat. And I suppose I might slightly because I was thinking along these lines too, and I might slightly rephrase Matt's question if that's okay, but for the whole panel, thinking about these texts and well, in a formal sense, where the first person sits in these texts. I mean, Mont Blanc is most obviously interesting, I think, what happens to the first person in that text. But also, in a broader sense, going back to what you were saying, Kate, the kind of the sense in which humanity or the human might be decentered in certain ways across these texts. And I suppose it got me thinking, going back to Matt's phrasing, between the relationship between the personal and the planetary. You know, the planetary is a term we use in the description of this panel, and it's, you know, a term that eco people tend to refer to the global because it's seen as kind of not so anthropocentric, more about kind of non-human forces. So I suppose I'm really inviting the panel to reflect on this not small question at all about the relationship between the personal and the planetary in their texts. I'm not expecting kind of full answers from anyone. It's a very kind of rich topic, but it would be interesting to get your takes on that question. Could we start with Katrina and Dilara, please? So one of you, if you could go first, that'd be great.
I could go first. So I think in my reading of Cooper, I think the way Cooper phrases and sees volcanic catastrophe that he's not aware of, he's only aware of the aftermath of the volcanic disaster without being able to make a connection between the effects of it and the origins of it. I think, yes, in my reading, he kind of zooms out and then zooms in again. So he goes out to the planetary. He reads the local signs of change, the weather anomalies, and then starts projecting and thinking about the planetary and how the relationship between the individual and the planet can be restored. And obviously, because Cooper is, well, very religious, and his understanding of the universe is quite theological, so it's very Christian. So it's a reconnection. It has to do with morality and being able to restore this relationship with the divine. But and then goes back to the local again, and you can see that in the structure of the task as well. So we've got the timepiece, and then where he talks about these weather anomalies, and then on book 3, I think he goes back to talking about his garden and his cucumbers. So, which is a very prosaic, mundane transition. It's nothing to do with the sublime, right? So, yeah, I would say that I think, yeah, I would say that, I mean, it's not very academic, but yes, I think he zooms in and zooms out across those scales. And in this sense, we get the, well, we understand, well, he does demonstrate that there's an early understanding of the different scales of the planetary and the personal, and maybe the spiritual or the theological at the same time. So, and I guess maybe this connects a bit with solastalgia as well, because for me, Cooper, because for me, I see him standing between the Holocene and the Anthropocene. And it seems to me that he faces like the first effects of the Anthropocene. And then it's like he starts growing this nostalgia for the Holocene and going back to, what he knew to be a stable planet.
Thanks very much, Katrina. And yeah, I mean, he's very much a poet of the local as well, isn't he? Anyway, I could go on about that, but I won't. I will ask Dilara, I think particularly about The Last Man. You know, I've taught that a few times. One of the challenges of teaching it is that you've got this kind of very kind of sort of romance element to it about these sort of relationships for about almost half the novel, and then you've got all this crazy sort of planetary stuff happening in the second half, and how those two things mesh or don't. So, what's your take on the kind of personal and the planetary in that novel, Dilara?
I think that novel is like so fascinating to me because, as you have said, we have romantic elements on one side, and then we see like a destruction of those elements. It's like Mary gives us a vision of romanticism, and then it's like she makes us awake from this dream of romanticism. She makes us see what is actually happening. So for this interesting question, I think Mary Shelley's sense of subjectivity seems to emerge through isolation and like introspection. Her protagonist, Lionel, becomes a kind of vessel for observing the past, like impersonal losses, like forces. We see plague, we see destruction, and yet his perception is like deeply personal, emotional, like we see Mary Shelley in like real life. She creates a tension between the inmate and the immense, I would say. Like the novel's apocalyptic theme isn't just cosmic, it's profoundly psychological. She actually uses like the first person narration to filter the fate of humanity through one consciousness. So the end of the world is experienced as an interior collapse as much as an external collapse. So in that way, subjectivity for Mary becomes a kind of interface, I would say, between the private experience of loss and also like the universal, almost sublime sense of extinction. So she actually combines a feeling of personal, and then again, we feel that feeling is actually universal, which is again such a fascinating novel for me, which makes an amazing work of art for me.
Thanks so much. I really like that point about interior collapse and external collapse. That's great. Thank you. Kate and Chloe, do you want to pick up on this question?
Yeah, I'd just like to follow on some of Kate's great comments. And I think thinking in terms of Shelley and subjectivity, I think we have to turn to Shelley's defensive poetry, because I think it really illuminates what Shelley is trying to achieve with his art form. And he says that poetry is a form which unites not only man with man, but with everything that exists. So I think for Shelley, that is the sort of key aims of the poetic form. When you're reading Shelley's poetry, I'm sure Kate will agree, it can be quite dissident, moving from the local and the personal and the first person perspective to these lofty elevated subjects like the stars and the sun, and it can be quite hard to wrap your head around how they both coexist. But I think for Shelley, his whole aim as a poet is to sort of utilize the meanings we can gain as subjective beings from objective elements of nature, and to try and interpret moral lessons from them and creative lessons from them, and to apply them to our everyday life through art. So yeah, I'd say that's my sort of input on that.
Thanks a lot, Chloe. Kate, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I was just having a think, and actually, I think all of those kind of networks and what everyone else has been saying about subjectivity is I would say Shelley's is very kind of outward facing, as opposed to a kind of inward facing subjectivity, through these kind of broader ecologies, both like the literary ones and these more philosophical kind of ontological ones that comes across in both the prose and the poetry. And I'm glad you mentioned the defense, because it made me think about the other essay on life, and he talks about he kind of dissolves the I and the you and the they into assemblages. So this kind of dissolving sense of subjectivity, I think, helps me conceive of it as like an outward facing, more multivalent subjectivity, I suppose. And for me, I'm interested in his like mistiness. So he talks about this mist of familiarity that obscures us from kind of like being and the wonder of being in these environments. And I think part of moving through that mist, because for me it wouldn't be about getting rid of the mist, but moving through the experience of the mist, is is being open and outward facing, and part of that is kind of on a planetary scale, I suppose. And I think moving from that small local microcosm to the wider macrocosms that he does through his poetry, it kind of, you know, goes out from the philosophy and the prose out practices in the form of the poetry. Those are my thoughts on that.
Thanks very much, everyone. It's been a really interesting discussion. We're not at time, though we're approaching time. So if anyone has got any final questions, speak now. Put your hand up now, at least.
I have a question, actually, if that's allowed.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
It's for Katerina. I was really interested in your methodological intervention, because that's something I kind of don't work in that way at all. So I was really interested in perhaps if you could speak a little bit more on what you hope, or what you'll be doing with the interviews, and what kind of you said they'll hopefully help us kind of reflect on the present, but what do you think the value or the kind of goal with those kind of reflections are, with your research?
Oh yeah, definitely. So, well, I've already completed the interview, so this is all done and dusted, which is good. So I can speak about some of the results. So what was interesting was that the participants took up those poetic objects and they engaged with them, even though, you know, they would not necessarily have this background in literature, but they engaged with it with excitement, and they treated it as a you know, as a discussion where they could talk about their own affective responses to climate change. At the same time, their, you know, epistemic commitments, especially for, you know, climate scientists. And so they talked about the continuities, what disaster means for them, and if disaster can be, you know, a fruitful way of making sense of the planet right now, because the apocalypse is still quite prevalent and very pervasive, actually, even in pop culture. And after that, well, the thing that I was not expected but happened, it was a lot of discussion around ethical imperatives and how we connect to the planet. So, well, I was hoping more for tracing the epistemic continuities and ways of knowing and treating the apocalypse, but after completing the interviews and analyzing the data I collected from the interviews, what I found was this affective connections and, well, distributed agency as well, and treating the planet as our dynamic home, where we're just, you know, guests for a very tiny amount of time, and thinking about the future in, if we can, in non-catastrophic terms, and some other results, you know, gesture towards using the chance to think through apocalypse and to mourn through apocalypse, and in order to be able to move forward into adaptation and adaptive strategies.
Thank you. That was so interesting.
Okay, and this is a good place to finish. Thanks so much, everyone. That was a lovely panel, such an interesting set of papers and discussions. So if we could virtually thank our speakers again, that would be great.
Okay, so thank you all again for coming this evening, and thank you to all of our speakers for, as David mentioned, wonderful papers. We'd also like to take the opportunity to thank David for taking the time to chair this panel. It's been a few months in the making, so everyone's devoted quite a bit of time to it, and it's been wonderful. Our next online event is coming up in November on the 12th at 6 p.m. UK time, and we'll focus on the release of the 4th volume of the complete poetry of Percy Shelley. So we'll hopefully have some nice interconnections there. And we'd also like to take this opportunity to remind you about the BAR's International Conference on Romantic Retrospection to be hosted at Birmingham University in late July 2026. The call for papers is now open and will close on November 30th. So please do send in your abstracts, as it would be lovely to see you all in person, as well as online. So thank you very much, everyone.